I was loading groceries into my Honda Accord last Tuesday when my phone started buzzing like crazy. 3 missed calls from my brother James in under 2 minutes, then my mom, then my dad, then James again. Already knew this wasn't good news. My family doesn't call unless they need something. And they definitely don't call this frantically unless that something involves money. See, ever since I graduated college and landed my engineering job 4 years ago, I've become the family cash cow. Need car repairs? Call Sydney. Unexpected medical bill? Sydney's got it. Want to take a vacation but can't afford it? Well, Sydney makes good money, so he should help out. The thing is, I've been waiting for this moment. Not hoping for it, but preparing for it. Because I knew eventually they'd push too far, demand too much, and give me the perfect opportunity to show them exactly what I think of their entitled garbage. James finally got through while I was putting the cart back. Didn't even say hello. Just launched straight into his demand about how I needed to pay his rent this month because he was behind and facing eviction. $2,400. Not a request, mind you. A demand. He told me Mom said I make more money than anyone in the family, so I needed to shut up and help out. The way he said it, like I was some kind of servant who existed solely to fund his lifestyle, made me see red. But here's what James doesn't understand, what none of them understand. I didn't become successful to bankroll their poor decisions. I became successful so I'd never have to depend on people like them ever again. The backstory matters here, so let me paint you the full picture. Growing up, James was always the golden child. Mom and Dad treated him like he could do no wrong while I was expected to be responsible, get good grades, and eventually support the family. When I was 16 and working part-time to save for college, James wrecked Dad's truck joyriding with his friends. Who got blamed for not watching him better? Me. Who had to give up their college savings to help pay for the repairs? Also me. That pattern continued for years. Every time James messed up, somehow it became my problem to fix. Every time the family needed money, I was the one expected to sacrifice. They called it family loyalty. I called it what it was, financial abuse disguised as love. So when I left for college, I made myself a promise. I would never again let these people manipulate me into being their personal bank account. And if they ever tried to pull their old tricks on me as an adult, I would make them regret every single time they treated me like a wallet instead of a human being. Back to Tuesday. James kept talking about how Mom said this and Dad said that, how I owed them because they paid for my college. Classic guilt trip tactics that used to work when I was younger and desperate for their approval. But I'm not that kid anymore. I'm 26 years old. I own my own place, and I've spent 4 years building a life specifically designed to be completely independent of their drama. After James finished his little speech about family obligation and how selfish I was being, I could hear Mom in the background coaching him on what to say next. Real classy stuff about how if I didn't send the money immediately, they'd tell everyone at Christmas what kind of son I really was, how they'd make sure the whole family knew I abandoned them in their time of need. That's when something clicked for me. This wasn't just James being entitled. This was a coordinated family effort to extract money from me, using every psychological manipulation they could think of. They'd planned this whole approach, probably sat around the kitchen table mapping out exactly how to guilt me into compliance. I told James I'd think about it and hung up. Within minutes, my phone was blowing up with messages from Mom about family loyalty and Dad about remembering who put me through school. James sent a text saying he'd already told his landlord I'd be wiring the money today, and that I better not make him look stupid. The audacity was breathtaking. They hadn't asked if I could help or explained what led to this situation. They'd simply decided I owed them $2,400 and expected me to hand it over because they demanded it. But the message that really got to me was from Mom later that evening. She posted something on Facebook about how some children forget where they came from and abandon family when they're needed most. Didn't mention me by name, but everyone who saw it would know exactly who she meant. She was trying to publicly shame me into paying up. That's when I realized this was exactly the moment I'd been waiting for. They'd finally overplayed their hand so completely that whatever I did in response would be entirely justified. For years, I'd been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always came through for family. Now they wanted to treat me like a doormat and humiliate me when I didn't immediately comply. I opened up my laptop and started reviewing everything I'd quietly put in place over the past few years. See, I learned a long time ago that the best defense against manipulative family members is having leverage they don't know about. And I'd been very, very patient in building that leverage. The beautiful thing about being the family's go-to money source is that you end up knowing everyone's financial situation intimately. Who's behind on what bills? Who's been lying about their income? Who's been making promises they can't keep? When you're constantly being asked to bail people out, you develop a pretty clear picture of just how precarious their lives really are. James, for instance, had been telling everyone he was managing his finances responsibly now. What he didn't know was that I'd been keeping track of every time he'd asked family members for money over the past 2 years. Mom had mentioned several of these requests to me, usually as justification for why I should help out more. Dad had done the same. Between the three of them, I had a pretty comprehensive record of James's financial irresponsibility. More importantly, I'd been documenting every instance of their manipulation tactics. Screenshots of guilt trip messages, recordings of phone calls where they tried to emotionally blackmail me, copies of those passive-aggressive Facebook posts, 4 years of evidence showing exactly how they operated when they wanted something from me. The reason this matters is that James isn't the only one with financial problems. Mom and Dad have been living beyond their means for years, using emotional manipulation to get their kids to subsidize their lifestyle. They've been telling everyone they're doing fine while privately pressuring me to cover various expenses. I sent one reply to the group text they'd started, just 2 words: good luck. Then I turned off my phone and went to bed, because tomorrow was going to be very interesting, and I wanted to be well rested for what was coming. The thing about cutting off enablers is that the people they've been enabling don't just quietly accept it and move on. They escalate. They panic. They start making increasingly desperate moves that reveal exactly who they really are. And I was counting on that happening. Update 1. Holy crap, Reddit. The response to my last post was incredible, and some of you called exactly what would happen next. Shout out to everyone who said my family would lose their minds when they realized I wasn't caving. You were absolutely right. So, Wednesday morning rolls around and my phone starts going nuclear around 7 a.m. James called me 6 times before I even got out of bed. When I finally answered, he was practically screaming about how his landlord was expecting the money today and I was making him look like an idiot. This is where it gets interesting because James started explaining exactly why he needed the money, and it wasn't just about being behind on rent. Turns out he's been telling his landlord for 3 months that his brother was helping him out financially. Not that he might help, but that I was helping. He'd apparently built this whole story about how I was covering part of his rent because I cared about his success. The landlord had been patient because James convinced him I was some kind of reliable family bank. So when James promised the money would be there Wednesday, he was basically betting on his ability to manipulate me into compliance. The fact that I said no wasn't just refusing to help, it was exposing 3 months of lies he'd built his housing situation on. James spent 20 minutes on that call trying every guilt trip in the book. How I was his only brother and family was supposed to stick together. How Mom and Dad were disappointed in me for abandoning them. How everyone was going to know what kind of person I really was if I let him get evicted. But here's what really got me fired up. James let slip that they'd been planning this approach for weeks. Mom had been coaching him on what to say, Dad had been helping him figure out exactly how much to ask for, and they'd all agreed that I was the solution to his problems because I made decent money and rarely spent it on anything fun. They'd literally been sitting around planning how to extract money from me like I was some kind of resource to be managed, rather than a family member with my own financial goals and boundaries. The level of entitlement was breathtaking. I told James I wasn't sending any money and that he needed to figure out his own situation. That's when he really lost it and started yelling about how selfish I was and how I'd always thought I was better than everyone else just because I went to college. This is where years of therapy and personal development paid off, because old Sydney would have gotten defensive and maybe even caved just to avoid conflict. New Sydney recognized this for exactly what it was: an attempt to make me responsible for consequences of his poor decisions. After I hung up on James, Mom called within minutes. She was crying and begging me to reconsider, saying James would be homeless and it would be my fault. She kept repeating that family helps family and that I was being cruel by abandoning them in their time of need. I let her talk for a while because I wanted to understand exactly how deep this manipulation went. Turns out Mom had already called several relatives to let them know about the situation. She'd told them I was refusing to help my brother avoid homelessness, despite having plenty of money. She was building a narrative where I was the villain and James was the victim. The conversation went on for almost an hour because Mom kept cycling through different approaches. First, the crying and begging, then anger about how ungrateful I was after everything they'd done for me, then bargaining about how I could just loan the money and James would pay me back, then back to crying about how I was tearing the family apart. What Mom didn't realize is that I'd been recording these conversations for months. Every time they called, asking for money, every guilt trip, every manipulation tactic, I had it all documented. Not because I planned to take legal action, but because I knew eventually I'd need proof of their behavior patterns. During this call, Mom said something that really crystallized why I'd been so angry for so long. She told me that I owed it to the family to share my success because they'd invested in me by paying for my college, that my degree and job weren't really mine. They belonged to the family, and I was being selfish by keeping the benefits to myself. This revealed the fundamental issue that had been brewing for years. My parents didn't see me as an independent adult who happened to be related to them. They saw me as an investment that was supposed to pay dividends to the whole family. My success wasn't mine to enjoy. It was a family resource they could access whenever they had financial problems. After Mom finished her emotional marathon, I explained calmly that I wouldn't be sending money and that James needed to handle his own responsibilities. I also told her that the Facebook post had been inappropriate and that publicly shaming me for not funding their lifestyle choices was going to backfire on them. That's when Mom made a huge mistake. She told me that if I didn't help James, they were going to make sure everyone in the family knew what kind of son I really was. They'd tell people at the next family gathering that I had money but refused to help when my brother was facing homelessness. They'd make sure my reputation in the family was permanently damaged. This threat was exactly what I'd been waiting for. See, threatening to damage my relationships with extended family only works if I actually care about maintaining those relationships. And after years of being treated like a walking ATM by these people, I'd already mentally cut ties with most of them. But more importantly, Mom had just made it clear that this wasn't about James's rent at all. This was about power and control. They were perfectly willing to destroy family relationships to get what they wanted from me. The money was just the excuse. The real goal was making sure I stayed in my role as the family's financial problem solver. I told Mom that if she wanted to play that game, she should be very careful about what she said to people because I had documentation of years of financial manipulation and emotional blackmail that might not look great if shared with the extended family. Mom got quiet real fast when I said that. She'd apparently never considered that I might have evidence of their behavior patterns. The idea that I could defend myself against their character assassination hadn't occurred to her. Dad called that evening, and this conversation was even more revealing. He started by talking about how disappointed he was in my attitude and how I'd changed since college. According to him, I used to be a good son who cared about family, but now I was selfish and thought I was too good to help out. Dad spent a long time talking about sacrifice and how parents make sacrifices for their children. So children should make sacrifices for their parents. He brought up every time they'd helped me growing up, every dollar they'd spent on me, every sacrifice they'd made for my education. But then Dad said something that revealed the real issue. He told me that he and Mom had been counting on my financial support for their retirement planning. They'd assumed that having a successful son meant they didn't need to save as much money because I'd help them out when they got older. This was the missing piece I hadn't fully understood. My parents hadn't just been treating me like a bank for occasional emergencies. They'd been planning their entire financial future around accessing my income. James's rent crisis wasn't a one-time thing. It was the beginning of decades of expected financial support. Dad also let slip that James had been receiving regular financial help from them for over a year, and they were running out of money to keep supporting him. That's why they needed me to take over funding his lifestyle. It wasn't about helping James through a temporary crisis. It was about making me permanently responsible for his poor financial decisions. By Thursday morning, James was calling again, but this time he was panicking. His landlord had given him until Friday to pay or start the eviction process. James begged me to reconsider, promising he'd pay me back and that this was the last time he'd ever ask for help. I told James that I'd be happy to help him look for resources like financial assistance programs or budgeting help, but I wouldn't be sending money. That's when he got really nasty and started saying I'd always been jealous of him and that I was using this situation to get revenge for childhood grudges. The projection was incredible. James was accusing me of exactly what I was actually doing, but he thought it was about petty childhood resentment rather than years of systematic financial manipulation and emotional blackmail. Friday afternoon, my phone was blowing up with updates from James about how the eviction process was starting and how it was all my fault. Mom was sending me pictures of James looking sad and defeated. Dad was leaving voicemails about how I was destroying the family, but here's the thing. I'd been preparing for this moment for years, and I had plans they didn't know about. Plans that were about to make their lives very, very complicated. Because while they'd been focused on making me feel guilty about James's situation, I'd been quietly positioning myself to show them exactly what happens when you treat family members like disposable resources. The real fun was about to begin. Update 2. Reddit. You guys have been incredible with the support and advice. Some of you figured out exactly what I was planning, and honestly, it felt good to know other people understood that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire when dealing with manipulative family members. So the weekend arrives and James is officially facing eviction proceedings. His landlord filed the papers Friday afternoon, and James spent Saturday calling me every 2 hours begging me to reconsider. But here's where it gets really interesting. James finally admitted some things during these calls that revealed just how deep this manipulation goes. Turns out James has been unemployed for 6 months. Not laid off, not between jobs, fired for attendance issues, and then just stopped looking for work because mom and dad were covering his basic expenses. He'd been lying to everyone about having a job, showing up to family gatherings with stories about his workday and plans for advancement. The $2,400 wasn't just for this month's rent. James owed 3 months of back rent and had been telling his landlord that his family was helping him catch up. He'd been living in this apartment for almost a year without paying full rent, using family financial support and lies to maintain his housing. But the part that really got to me was when James explained why he thought I should pay. He said that since I don't have a girlfriend or kids, my money isn't really going toward anything important anyway. He actually said that my financial responsibility to the family was greater than his because I had fewer personal obligations. This revealed something I'd suspected but never heard directly. My family didn't just see me as a resource. They thought I existed primarily to serve their needs. Since I wasn't married or supporting children, they believed my primary purpose was funding their lifestyle choices and poor decisions. Sunday morning, Mom called with a new approach. She'd been talking to Aunt Tracy, and apparently the whole extended family was now involved in pressuring me to help James. Mom spent 40 minutes explaining how everyone was disappointed in me and how I was damaging relationships that had taken decades to build. This conversation was crucial because Mom revealed the real reason behind their attitude. She told me that when I was growing up, the family had made sacrifices to ensure I got a good education and opportunities. Now that those investments had paid off with my engineering job, they expected returns on those investments. Mom specifically mentioned that they'd turned down help from relatives years ago because they were confident that having a successful son would eventually solve their financial problems. They'd literally bet their financial future on their ability to access my income. And now they were panicking because that plan wasn't working. But Mom also made a huge mistake during this call. She told me that if I didn't help James, they were prepared to make my life very difficult. They'd been discussing ways to pressure me, including showing up at my workplace to explain the situation to my boss and coworkers. They were considering contacting my friends to let them know what kind of person I really was. This threat crossed a line that even I hadn't expected them to cross. They were willing to potentially damage my professional reputation and personal relationships to extract money from me. The manipulation had escalated to attempted sabotage of my career and social life. That's when I decided it was time to show them exactly what I'd been preparing for all these years. See, while they'd been planning how to manipulate me, I'd been documenting their behavior and quietly positioning myself to have leverage over their lives. I told Mom that before she started making threats about my job and friends, she should probably consider her own vulnerable position. Then I mentioned something that made her go completely silent. I brought up the house. Here's what my family doesn't know, or didn't know, until that conversation. 3 years ago, when my parents were struggling with their mortgage payments, they'd asked me to co-sign a refinancing agreement. At the time, they presented it as a temporary arrangement that would lower their monthly payments and give them financial breathing room. What actually happened was that my signature on those documents made me equally responsible for their mortgage. If they defaulted, the bank would come after me for the full amount. My parents had essentially made me a silent partner in their housing situation without fully explaining the implications. But here's the beautiful part. The same documents that made me liable for their debt also gave me legal standing to be involved in decisions about the property. I'd spent 2 years quietly researching exactly what rights and options that co-signature gave me. When I mentioned the house to Mom, she immediately started backtracking on her threats about contacting my employer. She suddenly remembered that I was reasonable and that we could work things out as a family without involving outside people. I told Mom that I thought it was time we had a family meeting to discuss everyone's financial situation honestly. No more lies about James having a job, no more pretending that their retirement plans were realistic, and definitely no more threats about damaging my professional reputation. Mom agreed to the meeting immediately, which confirmed that she understood exactly how precarious their situation really was. We scheduled it for Wednesday evening at their house, and I told her that everyone needed to bring documentation of their actual financial status. Monday brought a series of increasingly panicked calls from James. His landlord had accelerated the eviction timeline, and James was looking at being out of his apartment by Thursday. But instead of just begging for money, James was now trying to negotiate partial payments and extended timelines. This was interesting because it showed James actually did have some capacity for problem solving and communication with his landlord. He'd just been choosing manipulation and family guilt trips because he thought they were easier than taking responsibility for his situation. During one of these calls, James admitted something that explained a lot about his attitude. He told me that Dad had always said I was the smart one who would be successful, and that meant I had obligations to help family members who weren't as fortunate. James had grown up believing that my role in the family was to eventually support him financially. This wasn't entitlement that had developed recently. This was a family dynamic that had been planned and reinforced for decades. My parents had literally raised James to expect financial support from me, and they'd raised me to feel guilty if I didn't provide it. Tuesday, Dad called to discuss the family meeting, and this conversation revealed even more about their strategy. Dad wanted to know what documentation I was planning to bring and what I hoped to accomplish with the meeting. He was trying to prepare talking points and defensive strategies. But Dad also made it clear that they viewed this meeting as a negotiation where they would convince me to help James while also agreeing to some kind of structured support system for the future. They weren't planning to change their fundamental approach. They were planning to formalize it. I told Dad that the meeting was about establishing new boundaries and making sure everyone understood the actual financial realities we were all dealing with. I mentioned that I had documentation of years of financial requests and manipulation attempts, and that it was time to address these patterns directly. Dad got defensive and started talking about how family support was natural, and that I was being selfish by treating family relationships like business transactions. He said that keeping track of help you'd given to family members was petty, and showed that I'd never really understood what family meant. This response confirmed that Dad genuinely believed he was entitled to access my income whenever the family had financial problems. The idea that I might have my own financial goals or boundaries was fundamentally incompatible with his worldview. But the most revealing part of the conversation came when Dad started talking about legacy and family reputation. He said that successful family members had responsibilities to maintain the family's standing in the community, and that letting James become homeless would reflect poorly on all of us. This was the missing piece I'd been looking for. My family's manipulation wasn't just about money. It was about using my success to prop up their social image. They wanted to be able to tell people that they'd raised successful children who took care of the family, and James's eviction would undermine that narrative. Wednesday evening arrived, and I showed up to the family meeting with a folder full of documentation and a very clear agenda. I'd spent 4 years preparing for this conversation, and it was finally time to show them exactly what happens when you treat family members like disposable resources. The look on their faces when I started pulling out printed screenshots of guilt trip messages and financial manipulation attempts told me everything I needed to know. They'd never expected me to actually document their behavior, and they definitely hadn't expected me to bring evidence to a family discussion. But what they really weren't prepared for was the legal paperwork I'd brought regarding the house and my co-signature responsibilities. When I spread those documents on the kitchen table and started explaining exactly what options they gave me, the power dynamic in that room shifted completely. James looked confused, Mom looked scared, and Dad looked angry. But none of them looked like they were in control of the situation anymore. That's when I told them exactly what was going to happen next, and why their days of treating me like a family ATM were officially over. Final update. Reddit. Holy crap. The family meeting happened, and it was everything I hoped it would be. Thank you to everyone who encouraged me to stand firm and not cave to their manipulation. You guys were absolutely right about what needed to happen. So Wednesday evening, I walked into that house with 4 years of documentation and a very clear plan. The kitchen table was set up like we were having some kind of friendly family discussion. But the moment I started spreading out printed screenshots of their guilt trip messages and financial manipulation attempts, the atmosphere changed completely. Mom started by trying to control the narrative, talking about how we needed to work together as a family to help James through his crisis. She had this whole speech prepared about family loyalty and how successful family members have obligations to help those who are struggling. I let her finish, then I started reading directly from her own messages. The Facebook post about ungrateful children, the texts about making my life difficult if I didn't pay up, the voicemails about how I owed them because they invested in my education. Mom's face got redder with each example, and by the end she was sitting there in complete silence. Dad tried to jump in and defend their approach, talking about how parents sacrifice for their children and expect help when they need it. He said keeping records of family conversations was manipulative and showed that I didn't understand what family relationships were supposed to be about. That's when I pulled out the mortgage documents. I spread them across the table and started explaining exactly what my co-signature meant in legal terms, how I was equally responsible for their house payments, but also how that responsibility gave me certain rights regarding the property. James looked confused, but Mom and Dad immediately understood what I was getting at. Dad started talking about how the co-signature was just a formality to get better interest rates, and that I shouldn't read too much into the legal language. I told them that according to the documents, if they missed mortgage payments, the bank could come after me for the full amount. But the same legal arrangement that made me liable also gave me standing to petition for a sale of the property if I felt my financial interests were at risk. The room went dead silent when I said that. Mom asked what I meant exactly, and I explained that if they continued to threaten my job and social relationships as leverage for money, I would have to consider protecting my financial interests by exercising my legal options regarding the house. Dad got angry and started yelling about how I was threatening to take their home away from them. He said that I was being vindictive and using legal technicalities to hurt the family. James joined in, saying I was being cruel and that this was about way more than just his rent money. This was the moment I'd been building toward for years. I told them that they were absolutely right. This was about way more than James's rent. This was about decades of being treated like a resource instead of a family member. This was about emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, and threats against my career and reputation. I went through every pattern of behavior I'd documented, how they only contacted me when they needed money, how every conversation became a guilt trip if I didn't immediately agree to help, how they'd planned their financial future around accessing my income without ever asking if that was something I wanted to be part of. Mom tried to interrupt several times, but I kept going. I told them about the recording of her saying they expected me to share my success because they'd invested in me, about Dad's admission that they were counting on my support for their retirement, about James's belief that since I didn't have kids, my money wasn't going toward anything important anyway. When I finished, Dad demanded to know what I wanted from them. He said that if I wasn't going to help James and I was threatening their house, then I needed to tell them exactly what my demands were. I told them my demands were simple. No more requests for money without a detailed explanation of how they plan to pay it back. No more emotional manipulation or guilt trips when I said no to financial requests. No more threats against my job, relationships, or reputation when I didn't comply with their demands. And absolutely no more assuming that my income was a family resource they could access whenever they had problems. James immediately started arguing that these demands would mean I was completely cutting off the family financially. He said that families help each other and that I was being selfish by treating money like it was more important than relationships. I asked James when exactly he planned to get another job, and he started making excuses about the job market and how he needed time to find something that was a good fit. I told him that his unemployment wasn't a temporary crisis. It was a lifestyle choice he was making while expecting other people to fund it. Mom jumped in and said that James was struggling with depression and that I was being heartless by not understanding his mental health challenges. She said that threatening to take away their house was cruel and that I was destroying the family over money. This is where I'd prepared my strongest response. I told Mom that if James was dealing with mental health issues, then the family should be helping him access treatment and support services, not enabling his avoidance of responsibility by funding his lifestyle indefinitely. I said that giving him money without requiring him to address the underlying problems wasn't helping him. It was making his situation worse. As for the house, I explained that I wasn't threatening to take it away from them. I was explaining the legal realities of our financial arrangement and letting them know that threats against my career and reputation would force me to protect my interests. If they wanted to keep their house secure, they needed to stop treating me like an enemy when I didn't hand over money on demand. Dad spent 20 minutes trying to negotiate some kind of compromise where they would tone down their approach in exchange for me agreeing to help with emergency situations. He wanted me to commit to a certain amount of financial support per year, with the understanding that they wouldn't ask for additional help beyond that amount. I told Dad that this completely missed the point. They were still trying to formalize their access to my income, instead of accepting that I had the right to make my own financial decisions. The problem wasn't the amount of money they were requesting. The problem was the assumption that they had the right to request it at all. Mom started crying and talking about how I was tearing the family apart over pride and stubbornness. She said that she'd raised me to be better than this, and that she didn't understand how I'd become so cold toward the people who loved me. I told Mom that this wasn't about being cold. This was about establishing healthy boundaries after years of financial and emotional manipulation. I said that if they wanted a relationship with me that wasn't based on money, I was completely open to that. But the days of treating me like a family ATM were over, regardless of how they felt about it. James made one last attempt to guilt me into helping with his rent situation. He said that he would be homeless in 2 days and that I was choosing to let that happen when I had the power to prevent it. He said that he would never forgive me for abandoning him when he needed help the most. I told James that homelessness was a serious situation that required real solutions, not just temporary money from family members. I said that I would be happy to help him research shelters, and assistance programs, and job placement services, but I wouldn't be funding his avoidance of responsibility anymore. The meeting ended with everyone angry and nothing resolved the way they'd hoped. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life and financial decisions. They could be mad about my boundaries, but they couldn't manipulate me into abandoning them anymore. Over the next few days, James did get evicted, and he ended up staying with mom and dad temporarily. But instead of just moving in and continuing to avoid responsibility, the pressure of the situation forced him to actually start looking for work and applying for assistance programs. Mom and dad stopped making threats about my job and reputation because they finally understood that I had leverage in our relationship too. They started being more respectful in their communications, and they stopped assuming that every family gathering was an opportunity to pressure me for money. The best part is that the extended family drama mom had been building completely backfired on her. When relatives heard the full story of what had been going on, including the threats against my career and the assumption that my income belonged to the family, most of them sided with me. Aunt Tracy actually apologized for getting involved without understanding the situation. It's been 3 months now, and the family dynamics are completely different. They still have financial problems, but those problems are no longer automatically my responsibility to solve. They've had to start making real changes to their lifestyle and spending habits because they can't just assume I'll bail them out anymore. James found a part-time job and is slowly getting his life back together. Mom and dad are having serious conversations about their retirement planning instead of just assuming I'll support them. And I'm finally able to have family relationships that aren't centered around money and guilt trips. The whole situation confirmed what I'd suspected for years. They were capable of handling their own problems when they had to. They just preferred to manipulate me into handling them instead, because it was easier. Some people might think I was too harsh or that I should have just helped James with his rent to keep the peace. But 4 years of documentation showed me exactly what keeping the peace actually meant: accepting permanent financial and emotional manipulation from people who saw me as a resource rather than a family member. Setting boundaries wasn't about being cruel. It was about refusing to enable behavior that was destructive for all of us. And honestly, our relationships are healthier now than they've been in years, precisely because they're not based on money and manipulation anymore. For anyone dealing with similar family financial manipulation, document everything. Understand your legal rights, and don't be afraid to use whatever leverage you have to protect yourself. Sometimes people only respect boundaries when those boundaries have real consequences attached to them. They learned the hard way that treating family members like disposable resources eventually backfires when those family members refuse to be disposable anymore.